All right, we're back with another Bible Lounge. We'll be continuing on in the Made Easy series, in the mini series, Romans. It's a 5-part series. Today we'll be in part 2. If you missed the previous video, I encourage you to go check that out. Just hit my, Bible Lounge name down below, and you'll find the previous video. It'll be titled Romans Intro, Romans Made Easy Part 1. And today, and then come and watch this video. And today's video is going to be Romans part 2. We're going to be going through Romans chapter 1 through Romans chapter 4. If you didn't get a chance to look at the summarizations for the chapters, I encourage you also to look down in the description. I'll have them all listed from chapters 1 through 16. Memorize them. I can't stress that enough. Memorize them. These if you memorize these chapters, it'll help you so much with understanding and knowing the book of Romans so much more. So stick around and we're going to jump into it. Let's jump into it. Romans chapter 1. The summary for Romans chapter 1 is all are accountable to God for sin. Hopefully that explains it. That is the summary. Memorize it. Ultimately, the first chapter, you can break it down into 2 parts. It's kind of the intro, and then it gets into the meat. So chapter 1, I think it's verse 18 is where we get into the meat of Paul's gospel, where Paul starts really laying it out. And ultimately, what Paul's trying to do, he's trying to show the peril of man from chapters 1 through 4. He's trying to show the peril of man and the need to come to faith in Jesus, the need for justification by faith, for a righteousness that is attained by faith. So in chapter 1, he starts laying it out. He starts opening up his gospel message with the reality that not only the Jews, he'll get to the Jews in chapter 2, but in chapter 1, it's really all people. We could say the Gentiles, but it means all people. All people have no excuse before God. Why? Because Paul says God has revealed himself in what has been created. All of creation screams of God's glory. Psalm 19:1, if you don't know that psalm, is a great psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies above proclaim his handiwork. Right? That's basically what Paul's talking about. That God has revealed himself in the world. Like the world manifests the glory of God. And so that alone is enough for Paul to say, nobody has an excuse. But what happens then is he goes on to say that people, instead of worshiping God who created all of this stuff, people throughout the generations and the ages have made gods for themselves out of these things, of wood and hay and whatnot, and worship the creature rather than the creator. And people want to sin. People want to do wickedness. And so Paul says, because of that, God has let them go. And he calls this really God's wrath. He says they are under God's wrath, and a portion of God's wrath is kind of already poured out in the sense that he let them go. Right? God removed some kind of protective barrier around humanity and allowed them to go into the sin that they wanted. And then he lists all the various different sins, all in chapter 1 that came about because God let people go into their sin, and humanity just got more and more corrupt. And so the point, again, Paul's making in chapter 1 is he wants to show nobody has an excuse before God. Everybody's accountable to God for sin and must stand before God on account of their sin. Romans chapter 2. So it can be summarized like this. The Jews are accountable to God for sin. So in chapter 1, Paul laid out all people are without excuse and accountable to God for sin. And yet now Paul goes into detail to make sure the Jew doesn't feel like they have a special privilege. So before he gets to the Jew, he basically lays it out that God has a righteous judgment. And all people will come under God's righteous judgment. Either those who believe will inherit eternal life, or those who don't, and those who do not have a righteousness that is by faith, and they will receive judgment. And this also includes the Jew. And so he gets into now the subject of the Jew. The Jews are not exempt from sin and wrath and the need for a righteousness by faith, because even the Jew is under the law who was under the law, and they failed to fulfill God's law. They failed to follow God's law 100%. So in fact, the law proved just how wicked humanity is, because those outside of the law in chapter 1, we see they wanted sin no matter what, right? God let them go. Humans since the beginning, we've been sinning. We don't seek after God until God works on our hearts, of course, and God moves in our hearts. But humanity follows after sin. And then in chapter 2, when we're at, is the Jew, even under the law, is still showing to be wicked, because even under the law, they fail to fulfill God's righteous requirements and follow after their sin. And so Paul really, what he's doing, he's eloquently and wisely putting the Jew and the Gentile in the same place, right? The Jew has no special privilege. I think he even talks about this in this chapter. The Jew has no special privilege. I think he talks about that in chapter 3, or somewhere right there. But the Jew has no special privilege when it comes to standing before God on Judgment Day. Why? Because God's going to judge them according to the law. So he's going to say, look, you had the law and you failed to follow it, guilty. And then he's going to look at Gentiles and say, you didn't have the law, but you still continued in sin because of you have this law in your heart and you disobeyed that law. You didn't glorify me, even though all of creation screams of my glory. So guilty. And that is the peril of humanity in chapters 1 and 2. Ultimately, 2 is the Jew is without excuse and guilty of sin before God. So chapter 3 can be summarized like so. All are guilty of sin. Right? Simple as that. All are guilty of sin. That's what chapter 3 is about. Most of it, okay? Of course, chapter 3 gets into the justification by faith towards the end of chapter 3, but Paul reaches the climax of his explanation or his detailed account of the peril of man. So chapter 1, all people are without excuse. Chapter 2, even the Jew is without excuse. Even the Jew is accountable to God for sin. And then chapter 3, he reaches this climax to the point where he says, there is nobody righteous before God. There is nobody justified in the Lord's eyes. All are accountable to God for their sin. And ultimately, Paul shows the need that humans have to receive of a righteousness that is not their own, because he's already laid it out. There is no one righteous. From chapters 1 to chapter 3, he's laid it out. There is nobody who can stand before God and declare themselves to be righteous, the Jew or the Gentile. Everybody is in the same position in the sense that they are all accountable to God for their sin, and they need to come to God for his imputed righteousness, to be justified, to be saved. And then we get to chapter 4. Chapter 4, the summary of chapter 4 is justification by faith. It's like a little breathing room. Chapter 1, 2, 3, it's we're all accountable to God. We're all guilty. And you're kind of like, ugh. And then chapter 4, justification by faith. Paul lays it out. He kind of goes into detail regarding Abraham's life, because Abraham was an example. And he uses the example that Abraham believed God, and God credited that belief as righteousness. And that was before the law of Moses existed. And that was before he was circumcised. So he was declared righteous before he was circumcised and before the law of Moses. That's important. It shows that God had already established a righteousness that can only be imputed through faith. And Paul is saying now in Jesus, that is the same thing. We now must believe in Jesus to receive of a justification, a righteousness that is by faith. And how does that work? Well, Jesus is righteous. He lived according to the law. He satisfied the righteous requirements of the law. When we believe in Jesus, he imputes his righteousness onto us, and we who are guilty before God will stand at trial in the end of days, and he will declare on us, you are not guilty because my son took the punishment. So ultimately, justification, we are justified now. When you come to faith in Jesus, you are justified now. And justification if you haven't figured it out, means to be declared righteous. So it is God's verdict on us. He's saying you are now declared righteous. It is a courtroom type word. It is a courtroom word that doesn't mean we are still not guilty. We have guilt. We have sin, right? But when we come to Jesus, his righteousness is imputed to us. God declares us legally right before him. We are now standing right before God because of the righteousness of Christ. And wow, that is amazing. I'm so glad that Jesus did that, because chapters 1, 2, and 3, Paul lays it out. We can't do it. We are not righteous. We need God. We need a salvation that is outside of ourselves, outside of the law. And thanks be to God that he provided Jesus Christ. And when we believe in him, we are justified by faith and we are saved. And so, yeah, that's Romans chapters 1 through 4. I hope you are being encouraged as we move through Romans in kind of a summarized, though detailed account, a detailed summary of Romans. I hope to see you in the next video when we jump into Romans chapter 5 through Romans chapter 8. I'll see you soon.